Hello there. We continue our series of English book reviews, and the next one will be quite different from the ones we've been talking about lately. This is a Chinese philosophy book, the Mozi, in the translation that was done a few years ago by Johnston. First of all, I don't have the physical book here. I read this in a digital format, so I will be putting a picture of the book for those of you who might be interested. So, some characteristics of the book. This is a complete translation of that Chinese classic. It was published by the Chinese University Press in 2010. It's quite a big volume. I think it's about 1,000 pages or so. But you should take into account that it's a bilingual edition. So, in each couple of pages, you get on the left an English translation, and on the right, the original Chinese text, which is heavily annotated. So it's really, if you took all the Chinese part and taking into account that a lot of the pages on the left sometimes have only a little bit of text and a big empty space below or some notes, probably a book that would occupy about 300 pages, 400 maybe. Okay, so before we start talking about the book, some context, some contextual information is in order. So, when is this book from? Who is its author? Master Mozi, and what's this all about? So, Master Mozi is one of the great Chinese philosophers, and he lived approximately in the 5th century before the Common Era. And he founded a philosophical school, generally the 5th century BC China, which is generally called, it's a transition between the Springs and Autumns and Warring States period. Is a very intellectually and politically and economically dynamic society. You should imagine it a little bit like 15th century Italy, that is divided into different states at war with each other, with intense competition, economic, cultural, and military. And also a world which, even though it shares a common culture, is a world that in which the old traditional values that in previous centuries had knitted the whole of the territory together have broken down. And in this context, new strands, new trends of thought appear in China, schools of thought. Now, the most important philosophical schools of this era, which would also have a lot of importance all through the history of China until the present day, were basically four. One of them is the Mohist school, which is the one we're mostly going to talk about in this book review, but the other ones which need to be introduced for context are the Confucian school, Taoism, and legalism. So, very quick overview of these three schools. So, Confucianism is probably the most important. In fact, during the imperial age, it achieved state recognition and so became the official philosophy of imperial China. What characterizes Confucianism? Confucianism was very conservative. In a way, it attempted to revive cultural practices from 400, 500 years before the time of Confucius, during that's the Western Zhou period. It's, as I said, traditionalist. It tries to resurrect and restore those cultural practices of a presumed golden age. It has a strong culturalist and pro-learning sort of attitude, with classics that have to be studied, mostly literary, but also ritual and cultural practices that have to be developed. It's meritocratic. It believes society should be organized hierarchically, but with meritocratic principles in which the worthiest and most virtuous should be in charge of the political administration. And it believes in a strong moral society in which virtuous people acquire, because of their goodness and morality, a sort of charismatic virtue there, which leads others to follow them. And it believes in moral self-cultivation, and it also believes quite strongly in hierarchies. That is, it believes that there are natural hierarchies that must be obeyed. These hierarchies are in theory reciprocal, like father and son, husband and wife, ruler and minister, with obligations on both sides of the scale, the top figure and the bottom figure. In practice, they tend to privilege the higher element in the dichotomy. And the ideal for Confucianism is the Junzi, the cultivated scholar who is not egoistic or self-interested, and who engages in public service, generally working for the state as a civil servant with the purpose of doing good. Now, this is Confucianism. Completely different school, quite opposed to it, is Taoism. Now, Taoism is the complete opposite. Taoism rejects um, conventional social values and hierarchies. It defends that ultimate truth and knowledge about the world are linguistic and probably irrational. And its ideal is abandoning the world and abandoning administration and political careerism, which is considered dangerous and deadly, and retiring from the world and living a life in harmony with the cosmos, with the Tao. So typically a philosophy of searchers for immortality and hermits. Finally, the last school, legalism, is a quite modern, innovative school in the 5th century. It defends basically that the state should be organized through rewards and punishments and clear laws. It generally has a lot of disdain for the past and for traditions and for previous models. It believes, like Confucianism, in a sort of meritocracy, but not so much putting the emphasis on virtue of the ruler, of the ministers, but on, using objective measures and laws to select the worthiest to serve in the government. And, it believes rewards and punishments are the two methods of organizing society. The government has a certain policy, which might be military expansion or population growth, and, you should implement harsh measures of punishment for those who break the rules and don't follow the state model, and rewards for those who do. So a very statist model also. The state should be at the center. Okay, so Mohism appears at this time, 5th century. It gathered quite a large following and became a powerful school. But as opposed to the other three that I've been talking to you about, after the imperial period, after unification in the 2nd century BC, Mohism practically disappears. It remains in the memory of scholars and in some fragmentary texts, but to all intents and purposes, as a philosophical movement, it completely disappears until being partially rediscovered, I think, in the 18th, 19th century. Okay, so the writings of Master Mozi have been reconstructed from this disappearance and the ravages of time. And that the book that basically summarizes and collects all the teachings of Master Mo and his disciples, the Mozi, is the one that we are reviewing today. As I said, this is a translation by Johnston, and very quickly we can go over the different sections that the book has. So the text is divided into different parts. The first part is called the Epitomes, and it's like a sort of summary of some of the key Mohist doctrines. The second part, called the translation Core Doctrines, is probably the most important in the whole book, and it has a series of triads. There's chapters that are structured into 3 sections, like Exalting Worthiness 1, Exalting Worthiness 2, Exalting Worthiness 3. Some of the chapters have been lost, but this is the meat of the whole book. Part 3, Language, Logic and Science, is a very fragmentary part, which included all the reflections on logic by the Mohist school. Mohists gave a lot of importance to logic. Part 4, Dialogues, is a series of fictional, probably, dialogues of Master Mo with other people. A little bit, this reminds me a little bit of the Analects. It's in that sort of style, conversational discussion of ideas. And part 5, the last part, is a defense of a city. As we will explain when we mention the main ideas of Mohism, it was a strongly pacifist and rejected offensive warfare, which means they studied defensive warfare a lot, and they offered, Mohists generally tended to offer their services to people and to states being attacked by other states, and they became specialists in defensive warfare. And that's what part 5 is about. It gives instructions on how to conduct a siege properly. Okay, so Mohism was an important philosophy which in some areas overlaps and shares ideas with Confucianism and with legalism, less so with Taoism. In fact, when I read this book, I was surprised by how much overlap there was, especially with Confucianism. And this surprised me because, I have read Confucian texts before this, mainly and the one that mainly deals out of the ones I've read with Mohism is the Mencius, from a very hostile perspective. So I was expecting Mohist doctrines to be more at odds with Confucian doctrines, but there is more than a little overlap in them. Okay, so for those who might be interested in the book, a brief summary of what the main ideas of Mohism are will probably be useful. So let me explain these core ideas. So basically, they reduce to 6. Number 1, the main idea of Mohism, and probably the most characteristic, the most exclusive to Mohism, is the concept of universal love, Janai. Now, basically, what this boils down to is that Mohism believes that people, in principle, should care for all other people equally. There should be no distinctions. Mozi stresses that rather than adopting different attitudes towards different people, like privileging friends or neighbors or family members, love should be unconditional and offered to everyone without regard for reciprocation. Now, this is a very striking idea in Chinese political thought. It echoes a little bit some of the tenets, for example, of Christianity in the gospel, Jesus' message of love thy neighbor. But this idea that all people are equal and should be valued equally is very interesting in the way in which it connects. It prefigures intellectual Western developments like utilitarianism and consequentialist ethics. So I'm sure if Jeremy Bentham and Stuart Mill had known of Mozi, they would have, been very happy to praise him and to use him as, as a precedent, as a very good precedent. So this idea that all people are equal, that we shouldn't privilege our friends or our family members, that the world would be a nice working place if everybody treated everyone with the same amount of love. This is a very, very unusual idea in Mohism. It contrasts with Confucianism, and in this book, in the Mohism, you see this controversy, this discussion in which the writer brings the opinions of the Confucians, or attacks the opinions of the Confucians, who he sees as defenders of a restrictive application of love. So for the Confucians, Confucians are a bit contradictory in this, it has to be said. So the more canonical Confucian stance, like seeing in the book in the Mencius, is the idea that there should be gradations, that you can't love everybody. And in this sense, Confucianism is more pragmatic. And it's the idea you can't love everybody the same. You will love more your family members, your friends, virtuous people. This makes sense in Confucianism because Confucianism is hierarchical. So the view in the opinion of Confucians on how to improve the world is, start by improving yourself morally, then try to improve your family, then your neighbors, and in successive circles you try to expand the good. But Confucianism, I agree more with Confucianism than with Mohism in this, I have to say. Confucianism has this more pragmatic, realistic idea that it would be ideally wonderful if everybody could love, if the love thy neighbor, loving everybody undistinctly could be applied, but it's probably against human nature. Probably we would have to transform ourselves into something we are not before such a situation is real. So it makes sense to cultivate virtue, at least at the close and familial level. And more virtuous people will be able to be more empathetic and more disinterested and more helpful with others. And then Confucianism has also this strain in it because it's one of its main moral principles is ren, humaneness, which is love and cultivation of others to the exclusion of one's self-interest. But in Confucianism, there's the idea that only the most virtuous and most cultivated of people might achieve this sort of Ren state in a permanent basis. But anyway, that's one of the core ideas of Mohism, and a lot of the Mozi explains, it keeps explaining why we should love everybody and we shouldn't establish distinctions, and it makes a case for the possible refutations of this doctrine. Not a convincing case for me, but it tries to make the case to answer criticisms like this is impossible to do, this was never done, this wouldn't work in practice, this would be difficult to convince people to do, and so on. This concept of universal love goes along with, as I said, consequentialist ethics. The important thing is not that you want to do good, it's doing good for the greatest number of people. The policies should be valued if they bring the greatest good to the greatest number of people. So again, utilitarians, consequentialists would probably enjoy reading the Mozi because of this. So universal love was the first great idea of which is developed in this book. The second is probably the need for frugality. So Mohism believes in universal love, and it believes everybody should achieve a certain minimum standard of living which should be provided by society and by the state. But it's a very minimum standard of living. It's like the idea basic needs should be met. People should have food to eat, clothes to wear, and some sort of housing in which to shelter themselves. But beyond this minimum, everything else is excess, is corrupt, is evil, and should be severely restricted. So, for example, this is one of the things that gets them into conflict with Confucians, and some of the most famous sections of the Mozi, which criticize funerals and music, are precisely about this from the Mohist perspective, and excessive expenditure in things that are not necessary. So music, all the arts are perceived as, corrupting and pleasure-seeking, and the focus should be on everybody getting the minimum. And especially the rulers should avoid all these pleasurable activities. The same thing with funerals. For Confucians who value hierarchies and rituals, making proper funerals for your relatives and keeping certain very strict rules of mourning in different degree depending on your relationship with the deceased. That's a big thing for Confucianism, and for Mohism it's the complete opposite. Funerals should be very frugal. The focus should be on the living, not on the dead. So these two aspects, number one and number two, universal love and frugality, sound pretty modern, but there are other aspects of this book and of its doctrines that are more traditionalist or conservative from our modern day perspective. For example, the third idea, which is very important in Mohism, is its idealization of the remote past. One of the main arguments that Mozi makes in favor of his principles of universal love being attainable is he says, this is no utopia. This was actually achieved in the remote past. They have this ideal society, which some historians say the Mohists invented during the Warring States period. This period of the wise kings of remote antiquity before the dynastic period. Notably, Yu the Great, the controller of the flood, who might have been a god or a mythical king, but he was transformed by the Mohists into the sort of like good emperor who was always selflessly working and experiencing hardships for the good of the people. So he became the ideal ruler for the Mohists. So the Mohists say, our project sounds very utopian and very unrealistic, but it can work and will work because in remote antiquity it did. So we have a precedent in the past that this sort of society where everybody loves each other and everybody does good to each other is, not a fantasy. It's something that can be done. So its reliance on the past connects it with Confucianism, which also puts a great emphasis on mythical ideal rulers of the past, slightly different ones from the ones the Mohists put the focus on. But there is overlap because the Mohists also talk about the founders of the Xia, Zhu the Great, the Shang, and the Zhou dynasty. So there is a big dispute, like the Mohists say, our point of view is vouched for in classical texts that have been preserved to now. from the past till now. But texts weren't fixed in the Western Zhou period or in the Eastern Zhou period. They would become fixed in the Imperial Age, the classics. So these texts, were open to interpretation and to forgery and to adaptation or creative interpretation. So this idealization of a remote past is quite a logical strategy in most philosophies and religions until the modern period, until the Enlightenment, really. So it shouldn't surprise us. But it makes Mohism less modern than other types of thought. Okay, key idea number 4, and again, this is quite traditional, quite conservative, is that Mohism views heaven as an active moral power that rewards good and punishes bad in this lifetime. So in this, it reminds me a little bit the Old Testament view of God as it appears in most of the Bible, especially in the oldest books of the Bible, or in the book of Job. It's this idea that, or in the Psalms as well, this idea that good and evil get rewarded and punished in this very life. And there is a God that does these things. In the case of Mohism, it's not exactly a God, it's heaven, Tian, but it's an active moral power. It's not just some abstract entity that created moral rules and leaves humans to themselves. No. It interferes by leading to the deposition of bad rulers and putting good moral people on the throne. Mohism also believes in gods. Confucianism was a little bit more skeptical about the supernatural, but Mohism makes an argument in favor of a heaven that rewards and punishments and ghosts, which is basically the traditional European argument that states that ethics is impossible without religion. The idea that if people do not believe that their good deeds and bad deeds will be punished in this life or in the other by God, people would be immoral. And this is a very strong strain in the Mozi. It's not completely clear to me if Mohism and Mozi really believes in the supernatural, or if he is using them as expedient means for the implementation of moral practices among the people. But I think the most coherent reading of the text is that, Mozi does believe that heaven rewards and punishes in this life people, and that ghosts are all around. There's a strong attack on fate, where fate is being defined as this idea that things like success or failure, riches and poverty, long life, short life, are not determined by heaven and are not given as rewards and punishments. Of course, this creates a big series of problems for Mohism, because just as it created for Judaism and other religions, it is very obvious to see, and it doesn't take civilizations a lot to discover that people who do bad things prosper in the world, and people who are good and virtuous suffer bad things in the world. So the idea that God might be rewarding and punishing people in this life very quickly falls apart when a minimum of scrutiny is given to it. So Mohism has this issue, and I imagine it caused a lot of difficulties for Mohists arguing. In fact, in some parts of the book, you find Mozi squiggling, squirming, trying to counter argue people who tell him, such and such a person, or you yourself are in theory a good person, but you suffer bad things. Why is heaven punishing you if, as you say, the good get rewarded by heaven and the bad get punished in this life? Okay, fifth idea, and this is something that Mohism shares with Confucianism and even with legalism. It's belief in hierarchy and meritocracy. Meritocracy is the key idea in 5th century BC China, practically shared by everybody. Well, it makes sense in a context in which the old feudal and aristocratic structures are breaking apart, and the new strong feudal states that are appearing, are trying to recruit able, intelligent people for administering these states. So Confucianism believes in hierarchy, legalism believes in hierarchy, Mohism believes in hierarchy. So it defends a meritocracy in which power and ethics should flow from top down. So like in Confucianism, the most virtuous person should be the ruler, the emperor, he should select the most virtuous ministers who are not as virtuous as him, but are still quite virtuous, and so on and so forth. There's a trickle down economics of virtue from the top to the bottom. So one would think that Mohism, being so focused on universal love and on utilitarian principles and on the good of the many over the good of the few, might have developed more democratic or liberal forms of government than just meritocratic autocracy. But no, in this they are a slave of the intellectual thought of their time, and yeah, they believe in, the ruler is the virtuous one, and then the ministers are a bit less virtuous, and then the local ministers are even less virtuous, and power should determine what people should do and reward and punish, just like the legalists. Should be the rewards for virtue and the punishments for vice, and this should be seriously and rigorously implemented from top to bottom. And finally, the last idea, the last important concept that is developed in this book is pacifism. So Mohists are intensely against warfare, which makes sense from both their universal love and frugality points of view. Wars are, because all humans are equal, any war from one state to another is killing the people of heaven, and all people are equal. And it's also a terrible waste of resources, of human resources. Mohism makes very well the case that, when a person steals something from somebody, they are considered bad people. When a person kills another person, that's considered even worse. So war, which is the massive killing of people by other people, should be considered the worst of all possible crimes. And Mohism puts the emphasis, though, on that defensive war is allowed. And as I said before, there's one section of this book that is completely devoted to defensive warfare. Okay, so those were the 6 main ideas in this book. We're going to round up and to finish this review, which is already probably too long. I'll try to get it into less than half an hour. So final considerations about the book: who might be interested in it, who should read it, and what should you read. So this is a combination of a very academic book, especially the part in Chinese with the footnotes, and a more accessible book. Now, if you are not a Chinese scholar, I would recommend just reading, obviously, the text in English. And out of the different parts of the book, there are 2 which are worth skipping. I read them because I'm pretty exhaustive in my readings, but there are 2 parts of the book that were dull as dust, and that don't really add much to your appreciation or knowledge of the main Mohist ideas, which are basically part 3, language, logic, and science, which is very fragmentary, and I think it's probably impossible to understand or difficult to understand in the translation. So skip this part. It's boring. The only interest it has is in showing you how logic started to be developed in China in the 5th century BC, and how it was of interest to the Mohists. And the last part, part 5, is also defense of a city. Skip this part, unless you're really interested in siege strategies in 5th century BC China. This is an irrelevant part. The rest of the book is very enjoyable, especially section 2, although it's a bit repetitive because, as I've said, most of the chapters of the book are divided into 3 sections with the same title. For example, Universal Love 1, 2, and 3, and it's pretty repetitive. It's generally the first chapter on a topic develops the topic in a shorter way. The second and the third expanded, but sometimes the arguments that are made are pretty repetitive. It's still quite a lovely read. It's an interesting read. It's especially the sections in the core doctrines or in the part 4 of the dialogues. They're very readable and very enjoyable. If you're interested in philosophy, especially if you're interested in consequentialism, I think it would be a book that you would profit from reading. And I think that's all for today. If you have any doubts, any questions about this book, you can, just put a comment below the video, and I'll see you for another book review.